Good day, everybody. Dr. Lukosh is here. We'll talk about international marketing, which is chapter 11. There is no chapter in the textbook just yet, so I'll deliver a presentation using this PowerPoint. So you're wondering, what is international marketing? It's the application of the principles that you have learned thus far in more than one country. So a company that operates in the US and decides to conduct its business and marketing activities, let's say in Mexico or in France, would be an example of international marketing. Um, you also hear a term called global marketing. In this case, unlike international marketing, companies look at the world as one big entity. So, for example, if you look at Nike, to Nike, their market is the world, the globe. But if you look at McDonald's, what you will see is that they have websites specific for each and every country where they operate. So they kind of look at individual countries, and that is the biggest difference. If you look at that major US corporations such as IBM, Tesla, Caterpillar, Cummins, Starbucks, they engage in a form of international or global marketing, which means they operate in the US as well as outside of the United States. So IBM has subdivisions outside of the US. Tesla has multiple factories, one in China, one being built in Germany. We have Caterpillar, we have Cummins, they're an international company that takes part in activities around the world and extends supply chains from China, and of course Starbucks, another major corporation that exists in pretty much every continent around the world. Let's talk about Starbucks. It's for those of you who don't know, it's a chain of coffee shops, and here's an example of what it looks like to have Starbucks in China. They opened their first coffee shop in 1999, more than 20 years ago. And at the time, Chinese would drink about 2 cups of coffee per year. On average, the rest of the world would drink about 140 cups of coffee per year. And in China, 1% of the hot drink market was accounted by coffee, but tea took more than 50%. So since Starbucks have entered the Chinese market, that 1% of market share went up to about 10%. That means more and more people drink coffee. And so what we see happening is that tea drinking countries such as Japan, Hong Kong, and China are slowly catching up to the world average. It's going to take a while, but Starbucks is clearly influencing that trend. So let's talk about international marketing in the coronavirus era. First of all, what is globalization? Globalization basically is the ability of companies to move production and outsourcing in locations that are most efficient. It's the ability of people to move from place to place, hop on the plane and travel to any part of the world within a matter of hours. It's the ability of money to be sent to location or locations that have the highest use. So we had major players in the world. We have US, China, we have Russia, we have Brazil. But what's happening is that as all of these systems are facing tests and maybe falling apart, we have a competition between China and America, the way that they turn to their own nationalism. And so we'll see how that pans out. What I want to talk also about is the extent to which countries rely on each other. The biggest importer of Canadian oil is US, and Canada is our biggest partner. We rely on them. Also, manufacturing, has been happening in China. Again, companies have relied on that. This is not the end of globalization, but what's happening is countries are rethinking the way that we utilize our critical technologies, resources, and reserve manufacturing, to the extent that if we face this kind of crisis, how can we sustain ourselves better? And so the point is that globalization, as we know, is being redefined. If you look at France, the president asked companies to actually rethink their supply chains to become less dependent on China and other nations. That would have been unheard of. At the same time, governments governments, especially in the US, insist that certain goods like pharmaceuticals, medical equipment, even food, should rely more on domestic production, given that everybody in the world is scrambling for these items. I mean, if you look at China, it's changing its strategy, aiming not to be a low-cost manufacturing hub for the world, but for the maker of technology of advanced products like aircrafts and telecommunications. That makes Americans, Europeans, and other major nations reluctant to have major operations in China, just in case intellectual property is stolen. And finally, we need to rethink about the role of US dollar. That is the extent to which it is and has been and should be reserve currency. So US Federal Reserve has opened swap lines with 14 overseas central banks, basically that allows them to pump dollars into domestic banking system. It's kind of a new thing. And so foreign banks can buy dollars, easier and directly and pledge those as treasury bonds as a collateral. So let's discuss some of the forces that do affect marketers and businesses and how they make decisions. First one is politics. That is, it's the extent to which a government can influence the economy or a specific industry. For example, government may impose a new tax or duty on companies or industries, and that may change overall how companies actually operate. These factors are tax policies, fiscal policies, or even trade tariffs. The second one is the economic factors. These factors determine the economy's performance that impacts a company and has long-term effects. So changes in inflation rate would impact the way that companies price products. At the same time, the purchasing power also affects in how much or how little people can buy. Inflation rate, interest rate, foreign exchange rates, economic growth patterns, all of those are economic factors. Then we have social factors. These factors determine and describe social environment where the marketing takes place. Things such as cultural trends, demographics, population analytics are those. For example, companies that operate in Western or developed world is different than companies that operate, let's say, in Asia. For example, if you look at different kinds of holiday seasons, right? I mean, those affect in what people buy and how people buy, and they may vary from country to country. Number four, technology. This factor actually pertains to innovation in technology, in how, again, it affects operations in the industry and the marketplace. So the extent to which companies can employ automation, research and development, and implement technologies such as 5G, again, is going to affect marketing decisions. That is, not all countries, for example, have yet adopted 5G technology. And so knowing that is going to impact marketing decisions. Factor number five, in this case, we have some laws that affect in how business environment in a country is shaped. For example, the analysis can take into account the extent to which we have consumer laws, safety standards, labor laws, and others. For example, in how we can run marketing and advertising campaigns, the time of the day when you can and cannot run advertisements for alcohol would be an example of a legal factor. Number six are the environmental factors. Those include basically the extent that the governments and then countries value the surrounding environment. For example, if you look at tourism, farming, and agriculture, all of those industries are affected by environmental policies. So things such as climate, weather, geographic location, global changes in climate, environmental offsets, all of those do affect in how we can conduct business in those particular areas. So number seven is culture. What is culture? It's the way of life of a group of people, such as behaviors, beliefs, values, symbols, and things that we take for granted and understand mutually without much of discussion. And culture does affect in how we market our products. For an example, in some Asian cultures, public display of emotion is not appreciated, such as in China. So any ads that you may run in Asian cultures should refrain from, let's say, using public display of guilt or joy. It should be more subdued approach. Now, keep in mind that culture values vary within a country. Um, Also, countries have, or cultures have rituals that may be different. For example, celebration of certain holidays. We have certain symbols. In the US, for example, we have the US flag. If you go to China, Chinese flag is their symbol. At the same time, if you look at mythical and historical figures, those are our heroes coming from the past. And so understanding, the context in which you can and cannot use them is important. And also thought process in how people make decisions as consumers may vary from culture to culture. For example, in China, consumers typically like to shop more frequently. So Walmart has designed much smaller carts and shopping baskets as opposed to the US. And last factor is the competitive factor. That is the extent to which we know our competition is operating in those countries. So understanding the competitive landscape on a country by country basis is important also factor. So let's take a look at the map of the world. So what we see here is political map of the world I took from geology.com. And let's look at the United States, and let's actually look at the China. If you look at the landmass and the size of these countries, they look they're about the same size, landmass wise. But if you look at the number of people and consumption, US has about 4 times less population than China. So imagine and think of density and ability to distribute products is going to vary greatly by these two countries. Also, if you look at a country like Russia, it spans about 10 time zones, and it's maybe 4 to 5 times bigger than US. And again, think of the implications of transportation in that country. Just an example. Also, if you look at Europe, which is right here, what you see is the number of people living in the Europe is about 800 million, roughly, give or take, and the US has about 330 million people. And so, European Union and are the biggest trade partners with the United States. So again, if you look at Europe, you'll notice that there are a lot of different cultures, a lot of different languages spoken, and so that again has implications in how we market in European Union. You can't just use English if you're going to market product, let's say, in Poland. So let's discuss the marketing mix, or the 4 Ps. The first one is offering, or product service. So if we compare different countries, let's say we look at the language, culture, laws, technologies, companies may or may not need to change the way that they market their product and design it. So for example, if you look at Coca-Cola or Starbucks coffee, it's uniform product. It's sold in about the same way across the world. However, there are some minor and kind of subtle variations. For example, in China, Starbucks has introduced a green tea frappuccino. And if you look at Coca-Cola, if we market the product in countries that don't speak English, we're going to change the alphabet and the way that we label the product. All right. The second one is promotion, or the way that we're going to promote the product. And so, whether we use print, radio, television, online, or mobile, people may respond to coupons, rebates, or selling differently. And so what we have to do is to come up with promotions that are customized to a specific country and in how it appeals to their customers. Now, when we look at distribution, the third P is how the products are sold. It could be, if you go to Africa, it could be a small kiosk in a village, a store in town, or a website. And again, the way we distribute product is going to depend greatly on a particular aspects of that country and the infrastructure. Okay, if you look at, for example, Netherlands, if you look at Germany, they have a very well developed train and railroad network. So it's one way to move the product in those countries. But if you look at sparse countries such as Russia, it may not be as easy to do that. Now let's talk about price. As you know, price is the last, the fourth P, and we can price products, by selling by an item, such as can of corn. We can price the product based on volume, such as gasoline, how much you fill up, by subscription, that is, you're paying for Netflix or Spotify, or by even usage, for example, how many minutes or megabytes or gigabytes of data do you use. Also, we can do it, by performance. So if you want to price product, let's say FedEx, 1 day delivery overnight versus 2 delivery, the performance is going to be actually different. And so if you look at countries like China, the statistics show that people living inland um, earn a bit less and have a lower purchasing power, but people living in the coastal cities have a higher purchasing power. And so again, the pricing of products or services may depend on geography of a particular country. And when talking about international marketing and what companies and countries even can do to better adapt to this changing role, one is we need to understand and to educate consumers, that is, people that buy our product. So, when we stopped social gatherings and implemented the social distancing, consumers need to understand that, for example, restaurants may not operate the same way. If you look at the airlines, some of them are even removing the middle seat so that people, will sit a further distance apart from one another. Also, they would like to remove the last 2 or 3 rows of seating on the planes in order to use that zone as what they call quarantine zone in case somebody gets sick, and put people there. So again, people need to understand why companies make certain decisions. Also, we need to ensure that the production meets our worldwide distribution targets. So if you look at the global disruption of supply, you need to talk to them to make sure that they can supply. And if they cannot supply a product, you have to go and seek out different distributors who may be closer to home. Companies like Cummins and Caterpillar and others, again, are likely to move some of their production closer to home, as we discussed earlier, because that becomes a strategic decision to keep your business running the way that you expect. Also, the term I want to use here is omnichannel approach, which means companies can no longer rely on just selling with one channel. So if you look at retailers, again, around the world, what they do is now, instead of selling the product in a store, they say, well, look, we're going to move it to online. All right, we're going to actually give you a curbside delivery and so forth. But the issue with that is that not all the companies were and are ready to actually implement online selling just on a whim. So again, if you're going to start marketing internationally, you have to find a local partner that knows, again, the peculiar behavior and shopping patterns of your consumers in that particular area, so that you're better able to deliver the product or service that you're promising. I mean, no one ever says going global is easy at the best of times, but during these uncertain times brought by this pandemic, I mean, you can be forgiving for considering international expansion a future dream rather than a persistent reality. So it's not impossible, but what you have to do is, again, secure supply lines and then help your global partners find the best solution to meet the changing marketing paradigm. I mean, that is